This is Jennifer Pepito with the Restoriaton Home podcast. This is the show where we talk about the peaceful path to connected families and restored communities. Today on the show, I'm excited to be chatting with Dana K. White. I've followed her work for a few years because she talks a lot about decluttering, especially if you aren't naturally an organized person. And her newest book is titled Jesus Doesn't Care About Your Messy House, He Cares About Your Heart. And I might not have gotten that exactly right, but I'm so excited to dive in because in my group, the Restoration Home community, in the Peaceful Press, we talk a lot about the atmosphere of the home and the importance of having like a peaceful home atmosphere. And yet, in the chaotic season of early motherhood, sometimes it just can't be perfect. And we have to be able to be responsive to the Lord and our children and accept that imperfection. So I'm excited to chat with you today, Dana. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me on. This is so fun.
I've heard a little bit of your story, but I'd love for you to share with my listeners because some of them might not know you and know how you came to talk about decluttering and minimizing and keeping a home.
Yeah. So my story is that I was born messy. I was messy from, I can't remember ever not being messy, right? Like that's always been my default in any space that I touched or had control over. It went to complete and total disaster. Right. So, um, I thought that once I became a mom, that I would not be messy anymore. Because I thought, well, at that point, I'm going to be a stay at home mom and that will be my focus. And so at that point, of course, obviously, I'll get this under control. Right. And instead, now I know that even people who once were organized, once they have kids, tend to struggle more. Right. So after I became a stay at home mom, my whole focus was on my family, my home, and I was just as messy as I ever had been before. And at that point, I started to have kind of an identity crisis. Like, okay, why is it that I can't seem to get this thing figured out? And I wanted to be a writer. And I found out what blogs were. And I was like, I've got to have one of those. But I thought I need to get my house under control first before I start writing, because I wanted to write about motherhood and intentional living and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, if I do that, I would feel like I have to hide my house. Like I would be so fearful that someone would find out what a disaster my house was. And so I was like, I'm going to get that figured out first. Well, obviously I wasn't able to. And, well, I guess it's not obvious, but you know what I mean? So I was sitting in church, and I was so frustrated that God had not answered my prayer to make me organized, because I felt like this issue that I had begged him to change about me, uh, was keeping me from doing the thing I felt God was calling me to do, which was to write. And that was when God was like, well, just write about that. And I was like, oh, okay, that's actually a really good idea. But I started immediately, but I did not use my real name. I made up a fake name. I made up a new email address. Like I didn't tell anybody what I was doing, not even my husband. I had no intention of anyone ever finding out it was me. And I called it A Slob Comes Clean. And even though, because that's really catchy, but that's what had come to me, but I'd never called myself a slob before. I'd many times said, it's not like I'm a slob. I like things clean. It's not like I sit around doing nothing. I work constantly in my home. I just have nothing to show for it. Right. And so I just started writing about that, was not teaching anyone anything. And people started to read it and say, these are my thoughts. These are my struggles. I didn't know that anybody else thought this way. And then after about 2.5 years of, writing about what I was doing and people saying, please teach us what you're doing, I finally realized that while I'm never going to be able to tell somebody how to have a perfect house, which is what I always thought I wanted to know, right? Um, I can I can teach you how to go from completely overwhelmed to, oh, that's what you have to do. Okay, now I get it, right? Like I can do this thing. So yeah, this is the actual writing ministry that God had for me all along. It just never would have occurred to me because this was the last thing I ever thought I would be writing about. But so now I teach decluttering and home management, and particularly for the people to whom this stuff does not come naturally.
I love that, and, Proverbs 14:4 says, "Where there are no oxen, the manger is clean, but abundant crops come by the strength of the ox." And many of my listeners are moms who are homeschooling. That's so messy. There's so many books and papers and crafts and projects involved. And then with the Peaceful Press curriculum, we actually do a lot of projects, baking or making an aqueduct when we're studying the Romans, or making a water wheel when we're studying machines, or shaking cream into butter when we're studying the American pioneers. And so there's a lot of peripheral mess that comes with being a stay-at-home mom, being a homemaker, having a project-based homeschooling or literature-based homeschooling. All of those are very messy. And like, I am a big believer in somewhat of a minimalist environment for learning, because I feel like the more clutter, the harder it is for children to pay attention and learn. But also the way that we do homeschool also requires having some supplies on hand, and having a kitchen where you could actually make a recipe because you have some supplies in the pantry. And for me also, as a writer and a curriculum developer, my bedroom right now, I'm in the middle of writing a book, and I'm also planning another curriculum. I mean, I don't have an office. My bedroom has like multiple stacks of books that I'm using for research. And so how do you what are some of like the basic steps for moms who have all this going on, all this stuff that they need? Like, they're not being big shoppers and frivolous and just hoarders. They're just living a very full life that involves a lot of different kinds of creativity. How do moms get started sort of taming that chaos?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like that you come at it from this angle because that is the reality. For me, I was the mom who did the projects, who cooked from scratch, who cloth diapered, who all those types of things I was so passionate about, but my house was keeping me from doing those things as well as I wanted to do them. Right? Like, here's the issue is like, I know, yes, we can concentrate better when there's clutter everywhere, but when we just say, oh, you can concentrate better when you don't have the clutter, for someone like me, that's really hard because I'm like, well, actually, I can concentrate. And that's how the clutter ends up happening. Right? Like, as I get zoned in on something and I am able to, be like, this is what I'm working on now. And then the clutter is happening and it's growing and growing. And by the time I even notice it, I'm like, it's already overwhelming and I'm stuck. Right. So I think that understanding of like wherever you are in your life, that's where you are in your life. Right. Like that. So the function of the space has to be priority. But I didn't understand what that meant, right? Like one of the realities is that most of the people who struggle with clutter are highly creative people, right? Like we are project brained, we throw ourselves into things, we're the people that other people ask for help because we're always like ready to tackle something new, right? And so we end up with all this stuff that we've gathered for potential, projects or things to do with the kids or all these, interesting and great and wonderful things. But then those things have come in and now we are overwhelmed by those things and not able to actually do the thing that we wanted to do. So like one of the number one concepts that I probably would not teach. I don't think I would teach this if I hadn't learned it as I was writing about it on my blog, not teaching anyone anything. Okay. And I call this the container concept, right? So the container concept is so simple. And once you understand it, it's so obvious that I would have been embarrassed to like share this with anyone. But because I was like, oh my goodness, I just realized this. And people said, what? This changes everything, right? Like this is one of the main things I teach now. And so basically it's that I used to think containers were for holding things because I knew organized people loved containers and they had lots of them and they stuck stuff in those containers, right? And so I thought, okay, if I want to be organized like my friend, then I need containers like hers. But I would bring containers into my home and I would try to use them and they never actually worked. It's because I was just putting stuff in them. And then when they were full, I would buy another container. When that was full, I would buy another container, and when the shelf was full, I would buy another shelf, and then when that shelf was full, I would buy another shelf, and then I my whole house would be full of shelves, and I was like, "Well, I have no room for more no more any more shelves, so therefore, I'm doomed to be disorganized forever because we can't afford a new house." And that's obviously what I would need is a bigger house, right? If I was going to be organized. And so then accepting that actually a container is meant to serve as a limit, it helped me go, oh, okay. So all these things can be fantastic things, right? I could literally have just rooms full of supplies for the projects that I want to do. But I only have a set amount of space. The house I live in is the house that I live in. And so if I try to keep more stuff than will fit functionally, get toably in my space, then there is no hope of it ever staying under control. And if it's not under control, then I can't actually find and access those things and use those things and do the thing that I need to do. So accepting that, okay, I can have all the great ideas, but I need to declutter down to where they fit in my space. And that doesn't mean I can't do the thing. It just means then that decides how much of this project material I can keep. And as you know, as a creative person, often it helps you be more creative to not have all the options in the world, right? Like when you have to make do, when you have to make it work, like that's a great thing. But it helps me identify when I say, this is the shelf that I have for baking supplies. That's the size that it is. And if I try to keep more baking supplies than that, then I don't have room to make my dinners that we eat every, night. I may not bake every single day, but this is the space that I have. And if I will limit it to that, then that helps me really narrow down and identify what are the things that are the most important, because I can keep anything, but I can't keep everything. And then doing that gives me that functional ability to do the thing that I was wanting to do when I was collecting all this stuff.
That's so good. I love the idea of containers, and that's kind of what I did actually in the early years with keeping toys in hand. Because we have all these power struggles with our young children over cleaning their rooms or picking up. But if we just have as many toys out as they are able to put away themselves, and the same can go for clothes, the same can go for shoes, like just don't have more belongings than your child can put away. And that doesn't mean you have to get rid of it. You could pack it up and put it in the garage. But if you don't want a power struggle with your small children over cleaning up their rooms, then don't have more stuff than they're able to pick up. Like my worst nightmare has always been the massive toy box. Like that is a disaster because A, it teaches no categorizing or organizing skills to your children. It's just this big conglomeration. So there's no rhyme or reason to it. And then it's an overwhelming mess when they do pull it out. So if you give them, a small bin of magnet tiles, they play with the magnet tiles and then they're able to put them away. And don't buy more magnet tiles until they're able to put away that many magnet tiles. And I think just keeping it to the containers is such a good strategy. But what do you do for those moms, like, in the Restoration Home community and the Peaceful Press, in my work with those organizations, one of our big values is connection. Like I urge moms every day, look your children in the eyes for at least 20 seconds. Give hugs, be responsive, like have a vision for what you want your children to remember about life in your home. And your children aren't really going to be like, oh, my house was so clean. Like they'll know the vibe of it. They'll know my mom was warm and responsive and our home was a happy place. And a happy place is not a place that is filthy, dirty, and gross and chaotic. But also, a happy home is not a place where mom's always yelling at you to get off the couch or don't touch the windows or don't step on the floor, or, where mom's always yelling you about cleaning. And so, finding that medium where we are loving and responsive to our children, we make home a safe place for them, but we also, have a place that's like not so gross that it's uncomfortable to be in or that we set a bad lifelong standard for our children can be a hard balance for moms who, just had a baby or have 5 kids under 6. That's a really hard season. What do you say to those moms? First of all, emotionally, because I know that's a big part of your new book is, Jesus doesn't care about a messy house. He cares about your heart, is that it's I mean, we cannot be paralyzed by shame and then do nothing. But it is easy to get there, especially in that season of life where there really is too much for one person to do.
So yeah, I would say with as far as like, the function for the kids, it all does come down to function. So, with the container concept, what I always teach is like, what is the most important thing that goes in your house? Like if I determine how many crayons I can keep according to my favorite ones, I'm going to put them in the bucket first. Well, my house is a container too. And what's the most important thing that deserves space in my home? It's the people, right? Like the people deserve space. So we need to be able to plop down on the couch without having to move a bunch of stuff. We need to be able to sit down to dinner as a family on the table without having to move a bunch of stuff that doesn't have a home and just lives on the table. We need to move that off, right? So that focus of like what is the purpose of the space and what's the top priority thing in the space being the people and being able to do the things that we need to do gives me a different view of my home. So instead of finding places and getting organized, I'm going to say, you know what? The easiest way for my family to be able to relax together and be able to function within our home is to have less stuff. Like that's the goal, right? But as far as the shame goes, as a Christian, it's part of the issue for me when I started what I call my deslobification process, right? Like I thought that God was going to show me a principle that I was missing because I was like, I've prayed about this. I truly desire it. I truly have tried so hard and I just can't seem to do it. And so I was working on getting my house under control. And I thought, okay, there must be a spiritual concept that I have missed somewhere along the line, right? And instead, what God showed me was, Dana, I've always been after your heart. I don't care about your messy house. I care about your heart. And as he showed me that, as I was, and these were things I knew, right? But it's an example of how we can get so caught up in what we're doing that we think that we need to be doing this thing to please God, when in reality, pleasing God, we do that by knowing him. And knowing him means understanding that nothing I do gets me closer to God. It's what he's done for me, right? Like it's through him and him reaching out for me that I actually have a relationship with him. And so thinking that anything I'm doing or not doing is either getting me closer to God or keeping that means I'm not understanding what's going on here. So him reminding me of that in this specific example was freedom. The other thing that happened was I saw that the people who related to my struggles were also highly creative women, and that creativity and clutter go together, right? Like those two things just go together. We bring in stuff in to do stuff really cool with it, and then we get overwhelmed by it, right? And so I did not know that at the time. And as I accepted that, okay, this is how my brain works, it helped me accept that God made me the way that I am. And he didn't make me the same way that he made the person who is naturally organized, right? That doesn't mean that I'm doomed to be disorganized. It just means that if I accept that this is how my brain works, then I can find ways that do work for me, right? Like I don't have to feel like a failure because traditional organizing advice doesn't work for me. I just have to figure out what does work for me, right? And so that took away the shame over this issue of like, what's wrong with me? Because so for so long, I would look at my house and I would think, okay, the answer to this problem is for me to be different than I am, right? When in reality, I needed to accept the way that my brain worked and go with that to do the thing. I mean, I'm nobody's saying Jesus doesn't want you to have a clean house, right? But he doesn't care. It's not the thing that's getting you closer to him, right? And so that distinction is really important, which is why a 60,000 word book is helpful, right? To be able to support that thesis of like, it is, I'm not saying don't worry about your messy house. I'm just saying Jesus doesn't care about your messy house. But that freedom of knowing that is often the thing that we need to know to move forward. I mean, I hear from women every day, and almost every single time they will tell me that the actual turning point for them was feeling understood, that somebody understood that this is a legitimate challenge for them and that it's not out of laziness. It's not out of lack of intelligence or anything that they can't seem to do this thing. It's like, I've gotten all this encouragement over the years that was like, you should do this. And, your house, you'll be happier if your house is, not so cluttery. And they're like, yeah, I know that. But how do you make it happen? Right. But to be
Yeah.
able to do the how takes that removal of shame first, which is so
Right,
important.
and I love that mentioned being with Jesus or having a relationship with him, because I think often what is causing us to be so messy is trauma. There's a lot of us who, maybe we didn't have a lot as children, and so we keep too much stuff because of that trauma, or maybe we, had an adverse childhood where things were chaotic, and so we're overly controlling about our environment. And I think a lot more is manifested in the way we live day to day that comes from experiences in childhood. And the more we can be with Jesus, be transformed in his image, release our cares to him, the more peace and sort of balance we'll have in our day-to-day life. Because he Jesus is not messy. Jesus is not hoarding stuff because he feels like he's not going to have enough. Jesus isn't controlling the world because, in a negative way. Like, obviously God is in control, but Jesus isn't like micromanaging everybody's stuff because he's worried that people are going to break something. The trauma that we have, he doesn't have. And the more we are transformed into his image, the more we're able to release that shame and just live in that shalom, that nothing missing, nothing broken.
Right. But there's also a how to. And I think that that's the key, right? Is like, is this, I was a believer. I loved Jesus. I prayed. I experienced his peace in so many other ways. And it did not automatically mean that my house was under control. Right? Like, it was all the things that I really truly needed. The only things that mattered was that relationship with him. But there is a how to, and that's where I come in to teach you about the how to, right? Like, I feel like the fact that I've written 3 books about how to get your house under control means that, it's pretty clear I'm not saying who cares about your house, right? Like, I get it. I care about your house. I know you care about your house, right? But caring enough isn't always enough. Like, so that, but the ability to hear it, the ability to get that help often comes after the release of the shame.
Absolutely. And I think it's funny that you brought that back around, because that does sometimes require talking to a therapist about why you're having so many issues with shame, or talking to a counselor, a pastor, in a way, getting some of that off your chest, and creating new thought patterns. And obviously there also has to be better habits. Putting things back in the containers is a start, but I love that you brought that back. Well, it's been so fun to chat with you today, Dana. We're out of time, but is there just one last thing you'd love to share, or even where people can find you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, if you search Dana K. White anywhere, you'll find me, and the books are wherever books are sold, and most libraries as well. Just make sure you put the K in there because there's a man named Dana White, and that is not me. So if you don't put the K in there, you won't find me, which is perfectly fine with me. But yeah, and A Slob Comes Clean.com is my website, and so I have a YouTube and podcast and all that kind of stuff, and lots of books. So yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing. What a joy to get to hear from you today and to get some tips for creating more peace and just a better home without the stress and anxiety and shame that sometimes attaches to that. So thanks for joining today.
Thank you.